The cold in Siberia does not merely touch the skin, it hunts for the bone. It is a living, predatory entity, especially in the pre-dawn hours of February 20, 1938. The thermometer reads 20 degrees below zero, but the wind chill, howling across the flat, desolate expanse of the Narum district, makes it feel like the atmosphere itself has solidified into ice. Here, in this remote settlement, hundreds of kilometers from anything resembling urban civilization, the silence is usually absolute. But this morning, the silence has been shattered by the crunch of heavy boots on hard-packed snow, the slamming of wooden doors, and the sharp, barking commands of men who do not belong to the village. Soldiers. They move from house to house like a dark tide, dragging men out of their beds and into the freezing dark. Inside the modest wooden house of the Kučera family, time seems to warp and fracture. Klara Kučerova, known today as Klarina Masulis, is barely more than a toddler, a confused bundle of warmth wrapped tightly in a thick wool blanket. She huddles in the trembling arms of her mother, Marie. Klara understands nothing of politics, nothing of quotas, nothing of the Great Terror. She only knows that the air in the room is thick with fear, a metallic taste that overpowers the smell of wood smoke. Her father, Adolf Kučera, is moving with frantic haste, but his eyes are fixed on his wife and child. He has been given minutes to pack, to dismantle a life built against the odds. There is no time for long farewells, no time for explanations. As the soldiers prod him toward the door, he turns one last time. His face, pale in the dim lantern light, is etched with a desperate intensity. "Don't believe anyone," Adolf says, his voice cracking but firm. "I've done nothing wrong. I am innocent. They will investigate and punish whoever is guilty." He pauses, his gaze locking under Marie's weeping eyes. "Wait for me." The door slams shut. The heavy wooden latch clicks. Those 3 words, "wait for me," will not just linger in the air, they will burn themselves into Marie's soul. They will become the mantra of her existence, the rhythm of her heartbeat through decades of hardship. She will repeat them when the hunger comes, when the war comes, when the silence stretches into years. But Adolf Kučera will never walk through that door again. In October 1938, 8 months after being swallowed by the freezing dark, he will be executed in the courtyards of the NKVD prison in Kolpashevo. He will die alongside his brother Josef, his father-in-law Antonin Suk, and 7 neighbors from their village. They will be lined up and shot, not for crimes committed, but for who they are. Because they were foreigners. Because they were Czechs. To understand the magnitude of this tragedy, one must look back, far away from the gray ice of Siberia, to a place that seems, by comparison, like a lost Eden. Adolf Kučera was born in 1908 in Tekos, a village nestled in the northern foothills of the Caucasus Mountains, just 12 kilometers from the shimmering blue expanse of the Black Sea. It was a world of vibrant color, the deep green of the forests, the golden sunlight on the orchards, and the rich, dark soil that smelled of life. By the time Adolf was born, Tekos was home to 14 flourishing Czech farms. He belonged to the 3rd generation of settlers, men and women who spoke Czech with the lilt of the mountains, retaining the culture of a homeland many had never seen. The story of how they arrived there is one of displacement and opportunism. In the late 1860s, the dust was settling on the Caucasian War, 1817 to 1864. The Tsarist regime, having brutally crushed the resistance of the mountain peoples, primarily the Circassians, had left the region depopulated. The Circassians, who had held these valleys for centuries, were either slaughtered or forced to flee across the sea to the Ottoman Empire. The land, soaked in blood and history, fell silent. Into this silence stepped the newcomers, Greeks, Armenians, Estonians, Germans, and Czechs. After the war, the Tsarist government needed to populate the region with loyal subjects, preferably Christians. They offered agricultural land, tax exemptions, and relief from military service. It sounded like a paradise to the Czechs, who were suffering under the agrarian crisis in Austria-Hungary. But the reality of the Caucasus was no fairy tale. The land they were given was wild, untamed, and choked with dense, ancient forests. It was a desolate landscape, Trechikova notes. The Russians themselves avoided these coastal areas due to the malaria and the humid, difficult climate. The Czechs arrived and found they had to hack their farms out of the wilderness with axes and sweat. Many gave up. They took one look at the wall of green forest and the swarms of mosquitoes and used their remaining funds to return to Bohemia or Moravia. But those who stayed possessed a stubborn, iron-clad will. They cleared the trees, drained the marshes, and broke the soil. Within a generation, the Czechs had transformed the wilderness. They grew wheat, barley, millet, and oats. They introduced potatoes, beets, and tomatoes to the region. They built sturdy European-style dwellings from the stone and timber of the mountains. By the time Adolf and Marie were born, the Czech settlements were prosperous hubs of commerce. They built schools where children learned in their mother tongue. They founded so-called athletic organizations. They built churches that rang with familiar hymns. In the port city of Novorossiysk, Czech breweries and pubs thrived, bringing a taste of Prague to the Black Sea coast. The Russian authorities, recognizing the industry of these settlers, named the new villages after saints revered by both Eastern and Western traditions, Vladimirovka, Kirillovka. But the Czechs had their own hard land in the villages of Tekos and Teshevs, named after the rivers that fed their fields. It was here, in this Valley of Beauty, as the locals called it, that Adolf Kučera and his future wife, Marie Sukhova, grew up. Their story has been preserved by their daughter Klauda and granddaughter Margarita Schnitkova, both of whom still live in Tomsk, the memories recorded by Vasily Hanovich of the Memorial Association. My grandmother, Marie Sukhova, was a pure-blooded Czech. She never truly mastered the Russian language. Even when I was a little girl, she spoke to me in Czech. I can still understand it today, the sound of it, though I cannot speak it back. Margarita recounts the stories her grandmother told her of the Caucasus. It sounds like a mythic age. The Czechs worked from sunrise to sunset, but the land rewarded them. They had large families, loud laughter, and tables full of food. Merchants would travel from the cities to buy their harvest, sacks of hazelnuts, walnuts, dried apples, and pears. The valley smelled of roasting nuts and drying fruit. For a brief window of time, under the early Soviet rule of the 1920s, this prosperity continued. The policy of korenizatsiya, indigenization, encouraged minorities to retain their language and culture. There were Czech village councils, Czech clubs, and official support for their distinct identity. The new economic policy, NEP, allowed them to sell their goods and live with dignity. But history in the Soviet Union is a pendulum that swings violently. In 1932, the pendulum swung back. The idol was shattered. Stalin's regime declared an end to korenizatsiya. The connection to the historical homeland was severed. Expatriate associations were outlawed. The schools were closed, the teachers dismissed, the churches shuttered. The NEP was replaced by the brutal machinery of collectivization. The most successful farmers, those who had worked the hardest, like the Czechs of Tekos, were branded as kulaks, class enemies who hoarded wealth while the proletariat starved. The warning signs were there for those willing to see them. Margarita tells a story that has been passed down through the family like a dark heirloom. Merchants came to visit my great-grandfather, Antonin Suk. They sat up until dawn, drinking homemade wine, their voices low and urgent. They told him, "Antonin Yosefovich, terrible times are coming. Leave everything, take your family and go as far away as possible. Run." But Antonin was a man of the soil, rooted deep in the land his father had cleared. He looked at his house, his fields, his life's work. "That will never happen," he declared with the confidence of an honest man. "The whole world would have to shake for me to leave this place." He did not understand that the world was indeed shaking. In 1933, the soldiers came. They did not come with paperwork or logic. They came with rifles in lists. They descended on Tachos and Teshebs, ordering the inhabitants to pack. It was arbitrary. Why these families? Why now? Perhaps a quota needed to be filled. Perhaps the local commissar coveted their prosperous farms. They loaded their lives onto horse-drawn carts. They were permitted to take seeds, but only what the carts could carry. They drove them out because they were rich, Clara says, bitterness edging her voice. Rich, meaning they had 3 or 4 cows in a well-tended garden. That was enough to be an enemy. Overnight, the Valley of Beauty was emptied. The orchards were left to rot, the houses abandoned to the wind. The journey that followed was a descent into hell. Weeks of travel, first by cart, then crammed into suffocating cattle cars that rattled endlessly across the Eurasian steppe towards Novosibirsk. From there, they were herded onto cargo barges and floated up the Ob River, heading north, always north, into the deepening cold. Grandmother told me that the river was a graveyard. When someone died of exhaustion or disease on the ship, there was no burial. The guards simply threw the body overboard. The Obs swallowed them. The final leg of the journey was the most harrowing. They were transferred to crude rafts to be towed against the current of the Parable and Chuzik rivers, deep into the uncharted taiga. Hunger was constant. Then came the typhus.
My mother said that on that raft, it was like the end of the world, Clara recounts. Everyone was delirious with fever. My father, his brother, everyone was down. But my mother, she was like a miracle. She didn't get sick. She walked among the dying, bringing them water, wiping their foreheads. She was the only thing keeping them alive. When the rafts finally ground ashore on the muddy banks of the Chuzik River, they were thousands of kilometers from the sun-drenched Caucasus. They were in the Narum district, a place known among Russians as a graveyard without crosses. God created paradise, the local saying went, and the devil created the Narum region. They were dumped into the wilderness near a settlement called Namacheni. There was no housing, no infrastructure, just the endless, brooding taiga and the swarms of mosquitoes that rose like black smoke from the swamps. Those early years were pure survival, explains Vasily Hanovich. People dug holes in the ground, dugouts to survive the winter. They exchanged their fine European clothes for potatoes. The locals, the old-timers, hated them. They called them bourgeois because they had arrived with leather shoes and books. But soon, they were as destitute as everyone else. Yet the Czech spirit that had tamed the Caucasus did not break easily. Adolf Kučera and the other men began to build. They felled trees, built log cabins, and cleared patches of the poor, acidic soil for vegetables. By 1936, a semblance of life had returned. Adolf married Marie in their place of exile. In November of that year, Clara was born, a child of the taiga, but carried with the love of the South. Adolf was a doting father. He loved me fiercely, Clara says. He was the literate one, the intellectual. My mother would go to him to learn to read better. He was the pillar of our family. They thought the worst was over. They had survived deportation, typhus, and the first brutal winters. They were rebuilding. Then came 1938, the year the Soviet machine decided to devour its own. On that freezing February morning when the soldiers returned, the illusion of safety evaporated. As Adolf was led away, Marie, clutching little Clara, followed him out into the snow. She was desperate to say goodbye, to touch him one last time. A soldier, impatient and cruel in the biting cold, shoved her. Marie lost her footing on the ice. She fell hard, and her grip on the bundle loosened. The blanket unfurled, and Clara, 18 months old, a tiny, fragile figure against the immense white emptiness. "What are you doing to my baby?" Adolf screamed, lunging forward, his restraint breaking. The soldiers were on him instantly, subduing him, forcing him into the waiting transport. Marie scrambled on her hands and knees, scooping her daughter back into the warmth of the blanket, sobbing. That was the last image Adolf had of his family. His wife in the snow, his daughter crying, the gray dawn breaking over the prison of the taiga.
The men were marched 60 kilometers to the settlement of Pudino. From there, they were transported to the grim fortress of the NKVD prison in Kolpashevo on the banks of the Ob. The interrogation logs, now gathering dust in Tomsk archives, reveal the absurdity of their fate. They were accused of being members of a Czech nationalist counter-revolutionary organization. It was a fabrication, a fantasy created by investigators who needed to meet execution quotas. Under the infamous Article 58, Adolf and his kin were branded terrorists and spies. On October 27, 1938, the final act took place. In a fenced enclosure next to the prison, a pit had been dug. Adolf Kučera, 30, his brother, Josef, 34, his father-in-law, Antonin Suk, 55, and their neighbors, Vavrinets Panek, Ivan and Stepan Needle, Josef Hovorka, were led to the edge. The executioners fired. The bodies tumbled into the sandy earth. Back in the settlement, Marie knew nothing of this. She only knew the promise, "Wait for me." Years passed. The Second World War erupted, dragging the Soviet Union into a desperate struggle for survival. In the exile settlements, the hunger became a physical beast. My mother swelled up from starvation, Clara remembers. She lay on the bed, unable to move, her legs filled with fluid. I was just a small child, but I had to find food. Clara recalls putting oversized slippers on her hands like gloves and trudging out to the fences where nettles grew. The other boys had already picked the best ones, she says, the memory vivid. I cried because only the small, dusty ones were left, but I picked them. I brought them home. Under Marie's weak instructions, the little girl boiled the stinging weeds. They softened in the water. We made patties out of them. No flour, no oil, just green mash. They fell apart when you touched them, but they tasted like life. They saved us. Through the starvation, the cold, and the stigma of being the wife of an enemy of the people, Marie held on to her husband's innocence. "Don't be ashamed," she told Clara when the other children taunted her. "Your father is a good man, a literate man. He will come back." When the war ended, Marie wrote letters. She wrote to every agency, every bureau. Perhaps he is in a hospital. Perhaps he lost his memory. Perhaps he is an invalid and is afraid to return. Stalin died in 1953. The thaw began. In 1957, the rehabilitation papers arrived. The government admitted the charges had been false, but they lied about his fate. They told Marie that Adolf had died in prison in 1944 of an intestinal blockage. It was a softer lie than the bullet, but a lie nonetheless. Marie Kucherova lived the rest of her life waiting for a man who had been dead since 1938. She never remarried. She raised her daughter and then her granddaughter in the shadow of that hope. It was not until 1993, after the Soviet Union had collapsed, that the full truth arrived in a sterile official envelope. Adolf had been shot. Place of burial unknown. But the earth has a way of revealing what men try to hide. The city of Kolpashevo stands on a high sandy cliff overlooking the Ob River. The river is restless, constantly gnawing at the bank. On the night of May 1st, 1979, the river took a massive bite. The cliff face sheared off, collapsing into the water. The next morning, the townspeople woke to a horror movie. Protruding from the newly exposed cliff face were human remains, hundreds of them. The sandy soil, dry and antiseptic, had mummified the bodies in the lower layers. You could see faces, you could see bullet holes in the backs of skulls. It was a cross-section of the Great Terror, a geological layer of genocide. Adolf Kučera was likely there in that mass grave. But there would be no memorial. The Soviet authorities, terrified of the scandal, reacted with panic and brutality. They cordoned off the riverbank. They brought in tugboats with powerful propellers. For days, the tugs churned the water against the bank, creating a wash to erode the rest of the grave and pulverize the remains. Soldiers and motorboats patrolled the river, using boat hooks to snag floating corpses. They tied scrap metal to the bodies to sink them. They smashed skulls with oars. It was a second execution. The dead were killed again. Their bones ground into the riverbed so that no trace of the crime would remain. Today, the river flows on, gray and indifferent. Marie is gone now. She passed away without ever knowing the gruesome details of the corpse washout. Clara and Margarita remain in Tomsk, the descendants of the Valley of Beauty, living in the land of exile. "We survived," Margarita says quietly. They visited the Caucasus years later, seeing the ghostly remnants of the Czech villages, the orchards now wild and overgrown. But their life is in Siberia now. The story of Adolf Kučera ends not with a grave, but with a memory. A young father in the snow, shouting against the wind, trying to protect his dignity in the eyes of his child, and a promise that outlived him, outlived the executioners, and outlived the empire that killed him. Wait for me.